The modern state, particularly the so-called Westphalian state, that has characteristics of European creation of states, where the state is divided into the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, is something that is unique in the sense that for many young nations, particularly those which were colonized, they had it imposed on them. You will remember in most of the world where the imperial powers were, they were dominated. If it was the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Italian, the Germans, and the Spaniards, they ruled these countries that they dominated as external territories of their countries, and they were controlled from the metropole. For example, the Dutch would control Indonesia from their country in the Netherlands. And when the countries regained independence, the financial architecture that they inherited was an architecture that was alien. And it was alien in the sense that the states were run on the basis of taxation. And therefore, it was assumed that if you tax the resources of the people, then they would be in a position to run the state. In many African countries, it started with poll tax or hard tax. They would say, you own this, then we are going to tax you. And taxation, therefore, became the source of financing affairs of the state. And the state has many affairs. Its defense is one of the things that the state was involved. How do you finance your defense? How do you finance your civil service? How do you finance importation of goods and services? So taxation is the major source of financing for any nation. But it soon emerges that the domestic resources that is obtained through taxation are not sufficient to take care of the needs of the society. And this is how loans come about. And these loans come about because they are institutions that are deliberately created to lend money to countries. And the colonial governments were the creators of these institutions. So that if you look at institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, first of all, they were created, as we know, in Bretton Woods in 1944. Just about the period when the World War II was in its last days. And these were institutions that were created in those early days to lend, particularly to the European countries that had been devastated by the war. So many African countries and non-African countries in Asia and in Latin America became drafted members of the IMF and the World Bank. So even when we say that Kenya is a member, Nigeria is a member, and all these countries are members and therefore decision makers of the World Bank and the IMF, and much later the WTO, which was also created and was conceived at that time, we must always remember that the membership of these countries is a drafted membership. We must always remember that they do not control these organizations. We must always remember that these institutions are created deliberately to ensure that they are under control, because, as the saying goes, the lender will remain the master of the borrower. And because the international economic architecture is also alien to many African countries, and of course that is true of Asian and Latin American countries, find themselves in a situation where they are playing a game that they do not understand and a game that they do not control, leading to indebtedness. In order to run these states, which are alien to us, you then incur debt. And then these institutions also ensure that they control your institutions of decision making. So you'll find them offering you advisory services. You'll find World Bank offering you a Ministry of Finance advisory services, IMF offering you a Ministry of Finance advisory services. And it's in the best interest of any lender that you continue to borrow. Sooner rather than later, you find yourself in a trap. And this trap creates an environment where you can no longer repay the debts that you borrow. That must also be understood in the context of the recruitment of political leadership in games that allow for corruption and wastage. So many countries therefore find themselves in a situation through the advisory services of IMF and World Bank and other institutions where they can no longer afford to service their debts. They have borrowed domestically, they cannot service the debts. They have borrowed from these multilateral institutions which they claim to be members of, and they are not in control. They have borrowed bilaterally from other institutions because there is multilateral borrowing and there is bilateral. You'll find a country has gone to China, has gone to Turkey, has gone to the United States, has gone to the European Union or individual countries such as Italy and the United Kingdom, and they have borrowed. So you find yourself in a situation where the ability to run your country is reduced because you have gotten into a debt trap. And that, in my view, is what IMF and World Bank loves. Because once you are in a debt trap, it means that your politics can also be controlled. It means that you can be directed on how to run your affairs. It means that you can be guided on what to do. And many times, these are not good Samaritans. They are bad Samaritans. They simply want to see you tottering along without ever freeing yourselves. And many African countries, many Asian countries, many Latin American countries have found themselves in this situation of a debt trap. And ironically, when you are in such a situation, the IMF and the World Bank, or as we call them, the Bretton Woods institution, come and tell you what to do. And the solution they prescribe normally get you deeper and deeper into the muck and mire of debt. All of us will remember in the 1980s when they came up with the structural adjustment program. They told government, get out of business, sell all your assets. And we know the consequence. I've always said, and I repeat it, that whenever the IMF say that your economy is doing very well, you should be very worried. We have seen it at one time when they said that of Argentina. We now know where Argentina is. We see what they said of the economy of Ghana, and we know where Ghana was. We know they are saying that of Kenya. Beyond the statistics, whatever they say about your economy is never matched by actual beneficial economic activity on the ground. I call it statistical growth, statistical El Dorado, land of gold. But in reality, you are suffering. So the architecture of international economy and the architecture of international commerce is designed particularly by Western countries to ensure that African countries, Latin American countries, and to a certain extent, even some Asian countries are kept in a perpetual state of desperation so that they continue to be economically dominated. Because when you are economically dominated, it is also possible, therefore, to exploit your resources. It is possible to ensure that you export your cocoa in its raw form, export your tea in its raw form, export your minerals in their raw form, export everything in their raw forms. It kills invention and innovation. And then you become victims of what they describe as foreign direct investment, which in many cases is a perpetuation of that financial slavery, which is wrought upon many African countries by those institutions. When we talk about the economic circumstances and the role of the Bretton Woods institution and understand the Bretton Woods institutions as instruments of economic control, There have been cases where this has brought about the question as to whether countries can survive outside of the orbit of the Bretton Woods institution. I'll mention different examples in the recent past. Chile at one time said, we are going to get out of the orbit of the IMF and, of course, the World Bank. Much more prominently is Russia. And Russia is prominent because it is a resource-rich country. It is a country that has an economy that is bigger than most, and it is an economy that is capable of being robust in its own right. It is an economy that has always tried to move away from dollarization of its economy, because it must also be understood that the IMF World Bank structure also means that you dollarize your economy and that you use the dollar as the point of reference in all your transactions, which makes